Hello and welcome to this special interaction on DD India. I'm Gautam Roy. India's national think tank NITI Aayog has just come out with a report titled A Green and Sustainable Growth Agenda for the Global Economy, which is based on the deliberations of an international G20 international conference which was held in New Delhi on the 28th and 29th of July in 2023. Now, the report says that the world needs over $3 trillion over the next decade to fund green growth, stressing the urgent need to mobilize funds both at the public and private levels apart from reforming multilateral funding institutions. A lot of other challenges and ways forward have been documented in this report that I'm holding. Let's find out more about it with NITI Aayog Vice Chairperson Suman Bery. Welcome to DD India, Mr. Bery.
Thank you so much.
Now, could you first tell us what was the idea behind holding this international conference on green and sustainable growth on the sidelines of the multiple G20 engagements that the entire course of the year saw till the summit, up to the summit in September, and what were the broad outcomes of the deliberations?
The G20 communique and also what came out of the so-called COP in Dubai on climate change, these are negotiated documents. And I won't say they represent the lowest common denominator, but they represent the art of the possible. It was my sense that the world is actually looking for something longer term, something about a new growth model, particularly for what came to be called the Global South, but not only the Global South. The fact of the matter is that the G20 has both rich and, as it were, large economies in it, and there are issues of...
Now it also has the African Union, so...
Now it has. We didn't know that at the time.
That broadens the perspective even more.
Yes. But the point I wanted to make is that we have all been operating on, at least the developing countries, on the basis of, if you like, an intuitive roadmap of global integration, of export-led growth, and many of these fundamentals were under challenge. And so the idea behind the conference was to get people from a range, thinkers from a range of countries, including India, the Indians were the largest delegation, to ponder on, okay, you know, each G20 presidency is going to move the ball a little bit, but what is our north? Where are we heading? Do we know where we're heading? That was, as it were, the G20 part of the agenda, and we were encouraged by the Sherpa. What I can say, as the Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog, is that this thinking is also relevant for how to think about Viksit Bharat at 2047, about what it means for India to aspire to be the third largest economy in the world. How do we want to shape the world, and how will the world shape us?
Okay, but it did mention certain ways forward, so that does connote action, doesn't it?
What it indicated was the latest, if you like, analysis and thinking, and the issues that were associated with it. Let me give you, an example. One of the contributions, only part of which was known in July, was the so-called expert group report led by N.K. Singh and Larry Summers, which pointed out the scale of the financing challenge and the reform of the multilateral development banks. Okay? So if I could just, for your viewers, indicate the way these things happen. So the G20 itself is a self-appointed group of 20 countries, and the leadership rotates. Now, they are, however, politically influential, and the importance of the communiqué is to indicate that there is a global consensus on such and such issues. Now, this provides the analysis. It's the New Delhi leaders' declaration, which then provides the underlying consensus, and there's a gap between the two. But actually, in the particular case that I mentioned, and this is relevant to broader issues, the final actions are taken by, as it were, treaty-based institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF. And in fact, it is the case that this consensus, not as reflected in the report, but reflected in the leaders' declaration, then provides, if you like, a benchmark against which the G20 countries in these institutions against which they'll be judged.
Okay. Okay. Now, mobilizing funds urgently for green growth through both public and private means and reforming multilateral institutions, lending institutions, has been an oft-repeated prescription to address the economic and other challenges that come out of climate change and other factors as well. Now, why hasn't it happened so far, these reforms that have been called for, and what does the report suggest, to break the status quo?
There was a report commissioned by Italy and then finalized under Indonesia, which talked about using their capital more efficiently. And we took that forward, the Indian presidency, but then we added an additional layer, which was the Singh-Summers report. And now, political leadership matters. I think that the fact that the new president was appointed, of the World Bank, was appointed by President Biden, that President Biden made a commitment to return to the Paris Agreement, which President Trump, all of this took time to develop momentum. And it was our good fortune that it was on our watch that Secretary Yellen visited India so frequently and put her shoulder to the wheel. She made an important speech in the US. So that's how, as it were, the political basis. So I would slightly disagree that this has been around for a long time. In fact, the World Bank, when it's got its last capital increase, it was very much on the premise that it wouldn't be back looking for capital, whereas now it's back on the table.
All right, great. Now, you mentioned COP28 and it wrapped up towards the end of 2023, and some landmark developments did take place as far as climate financing is concerned in Dubai. There was the Loss and Damage Fund, which was also announced, and some commitments to it have also been made. Now, do you feel that decades of inertia has been broken on these fronts with these developments, and more will be in store in the coming years, perhaps? Or is there still enough room to remain skeptical about genuine action on these fronts?
Everybody has to up their game. I would respectfully disagree that there was much progress on climate finance as general. So the two big areas that, we are, in a sense, tiptoeing around, Gautam, are one, climate finance, other than this 100 billion, which, is kind of phony money, although it... and the second is the sharing of the available carbon space. Okay, so there's been a lot of sand thrown up in the air, etc. So India and many countries of the emerging of the global South, believe that there's gross inequity in the way the remaining carbon space is carved up, and that on the basis of current plans, the emerging markets, there's no hope of both having growth and also meeting the 1.5 degrees. But there has been no formal agreement on fair burden sharing. Okay, so in the trade area, people talk about fair trade rather than free trade. In this area, they don't talk about fairness. So each country is operating on the basis of its own concept of fairness. What we do now know is that there are validated numbers of the scale of financing that's going to be needed, but is it realistic? Where is it going to come from? And I would make one, peripheral, but I think still important point. Prime Minister has said this is not an era of war, but the fact is this has become an era of war. And much of the world was operating on the basis of two global phenomena, both of which have disappeared. One, ultra-low interest rates, and secondly, the so-called peace dividend. People took a break from defense. Together, both of those have disappeared, and the rich countries are now scrambling with the cost of living increase, the increase in defense. So
I'll add a third, price of oil.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the price of oil has been up and down, but given what's happening right now...
You said cost of living, that is
right,
larger.
Yeah. No, the cost of oil impacts on us, but the breakup of supply chains, etc.
And the West has increased subsidies on oil, but this is another debate. Yeah. Now, India is a developing country, but still it's voluntarily increased its NDCs, its commitments. It's announced a net zero timeline as well. And it's a leading solar power producer now in the world. So India is doing a lot on the climate front. Now, do you feel the world's biggest polluters, the G7 nations and China, are they keeping up their end of the battle against climate change?
Arguably, they could be doing more in order to create space for the right to grow of a country like India.
The global south.
Well, yes, but let me also mention that the logic of India following a green path is partly to be a good citizen, but it's also self-interest. You know, we are abundantly endowed with sun for sure, and we are benefiting from a radical reduction in the cost of solar panels. However, the fact is also that while we may be diversifying away from oil, which is a very large part of our import bill, for a while we're going to get ourselves dependent on other critical materials. So these are delicate balances, and as you know, the Foreign Secretary before COP made it clear that India believes that it is going to need coal for a while longer, and I think my final response to your question is, how much importance should we give to whatever language was agreed to on fossil fuels? I think that's important for two reasons. Firstly, it was the first time, and I talk about the United States, which signed up to it, that big producers of hydrocarbons have accepted that in time they are going to have to reconcile themselves to less production. The second aspect of it is that it means that coal is not unfairly singled out, which it had been, okay? But the third point is actually when there were energy security issues in Europe, the Germans had to go back to coal, the Poles continue to depend on coal, and of course, the biggest producer and consumer of coal remains China.
Another key contribution that India has been offering to the world is how different nations could replicate the success of digital public infrastructure. The report says DPIs can play a crucial role in climate change action. I'm quoting from the report: aiding in anticipatory climate financing, the promotion of a circular economy, and the creation of energy interfaces. Now, has all this been sufficiently demonstrated in India?
No, I think that this is more the possibilities. Again, I would transition from what's in this report of the proceedings and what was actually in the New Delhi leaders' declaration. So it was a very important win for India in the leaders' declaration that the idea of digital public infrastructure was both defined and also accepted. And I say this because there are, parts of the world which believe that the best innovation is when the private sector innovates, and we've had these large global firms who have made for very efficient payment interfaces. They charge for it, but I'm talking Visa, MasterCard, etc. So, India has its own view of, as it were, the appropriate interface between the public sector and the private sector. And I think it was an important success of our G20 presidency that we got consensus from all those present that pushing digital public infrastructure is, is something that they commit to. And with that endorsement, we are now, of course, engaged in bilateral diplomacy to try and because a lot of this business is about who determines the standards.
The report also talks about, since you mentioned AI, challenges on the spheres of technology, policy and jobs, where it clearly says that generative AI requires a comprehensive regulatory framework, ethical guidelines and proactive industry self-governance, again quoting from the report. Now, the Indian government has been advocating some sort of a collaborative global approach on the subject, but how do you see this happening when different countries like the US or even a union of nations like the EU, they've been taking their own steps in the form of executive actions and even enacting new laws?
Is there a regulatory challenge? Yes. What is that regulatory challenge, and where is it that different countries occupy different positions depending on their philosophy? It is between, as it were, choking off innovation and running unacceptable risk. And the fact of the matter is that apparently even these companies don't know how the algorithms finally take their decision. And there's this concept of so-called hallucination, where the algorithm, if it doesn't have data, makes up ideas. So, we're entering a real science fiction world. I'm very attracted by something that, again, Nandan said at a recent Carnegie conference, which is that, look, we don't have to be in the, if you like, the space race for, maybe we do in defense, but I'm here speaking for the development agency. He said we should be thinking of use cases for AI. What does he mean? I think, one way of looking at it is that over certainly the last 10 years, with Aadhaar and with the embrace of digitization by the Prime Minister and his government, we have discovered that there are all kinds of development challenges, including financial inclusion, payments, etc., which semiconductors facilitate. And so that's what I mean by a use case. Okay, Jan Dhan accounts are a use case of technology. Aadhaar is a use case. So I believe it is, India's mission and NITI's mission to think about what might be those use cases. One example that's already been, was mentioned by Mr. Nilekani at the conference was mutual intelligibility, so that language is no longer a barrier. So this is going to allow the precision delivery of agricultural information.
Yes, that's what Bhashini is about as well.
Exactly.
But what about regulation?
Meaning, should India go on its own, or who's going to set the pace? Well, I mean, we had this global summit on AI. I mean, I think what has changed the landscape is that so much of the developer community is in India, and so many of the beneficiaries are in India. So in this space, India will be a big player. I know that there have been discussions on this in MITI, but I think what we will do, as we did with privacy legislation, is basically to be a part of the conversations before deciding what bits of it we subscribe to. Yes, in time we will need to have our own regulation, but this whole sphere is quite balkanized between, as it were, what's happening in China.
It's still evolving as well. Now, the report also talks about the growth implications of a fractured trading system because of what's been termed as globalization or deglobalization, because of what's been happening between US and China. India has been put forth as a solution to the problem by being backed as an engine of global growth. Now, to what extent do the latest projections, the figures given out by global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, really support this thesis or prescription?
Well, no, it stands to reason. I think yesterday at the book launch, the Sherpa, Amitabh Kant, mentioned a number which must come from the IMF, that something like 70% of global growth is going to come from the South. Now, all of this is prospective, but it stands to reason that even though we are a much smaller economy than that of China or India or the US, if we grow at 6-7%, we would have the same kind of impact. If this is altered substantially, affected substantially by the fact that the Chinese economy is slowing down, and therefore the contribution it used to make is diminished, and therefore, by extension, the contribution India is going to make is going to be that much more significant and important. It's anybody's guess what happens to the US economy, but certainly if Germany is any kind of bellwether of what's happening to Europe. So, if China is slowing and, Germany as an indicator of Europe is slowing, and if the UK is flirting with stagnation, then it stands to reason that India would be a bright spot in the near term. I don't know if your question was over the longer term, but I want to link it up with the issue of trade in a different context and link it back to some extent with climate in the following sense. You had talked about, if you like, the asymmetry, the hypocrisy, whatever. The fact of the matter is that we are in an environment where a group like the EU is putting in place measures to set themselves as judges of whether their trading partners are sufficiently rigorous on climate change, something called the carbon border adjustment.
Non-tariff barriers.
The carbon border adjustment measure. What matters for us is the fact that really effectively through US action, the rule-setting body, the World Trade Organization, no longer has what was called a dispute settlement function. Okay? So if Europe claims that something is WTO compliant, who is to judge? And so what happened when Prime Minister Modi visited the US in June was that there was a kind of a mutual agreement to settle issues bilaterally. But that's not the way. We can perhaps hold our own because we're a large market, but for that reason, I believe that India, for example, at the forthcoming WTO ministerial that's going to take place again in the UAE, I believe, in Abu Dhabi, needs to now take more interest as an emerging power in a rules-based order. Otherwise, we will be at the mercy of bilateral sort of power plays. And not only us, the global south will be even more disadvantaged.
All right. Well, let's hope we move forward in that direction, and that will lead to, of course, not only a better response to what is happening with climate change, but so many other scenarios that we're seeing unfolding in this present slightly unsettled geopolitical situation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity a great deal. Thank you.